Gathering up life and making it thinkable. Hegel and James Joyce's Finnegans Wake. Before proceeding to what I have to say about Finnegans Wake, I would just like to make a quick point concerning philosophy itself, which is very important for understanding where I'm coming from with my research. Ever since Plato set the ball rolling with Western philosophy, it has found itself under attack, or just dismissed. In Plato's dialogue, The Apology, which recounts Socrates' defense at his trial, charged with denying the gods and corrupting the youth, Socrates needed to give a defense of philosophy, and I quote, "This confounded Socrates, they say, this villainous misleader of youth." And then if somebody asks them, why, what evil does he practice or teach? They do not know, and cannot tell. But in order that they may not appear to be at a loss, they repeat the ready-made charges which are used against all philosophers about teaching things up in the clouds and under the earth, and having no gods, and making the worse appear the better cause. For they do not like to confess that their pretense of knowledge has been detected, which is the truth. End quote. And of course, in contemporary times, we find philosophy either under attack or spoken of dismissively, especially among natural scientists, as it happens, especially the ones that appear in the media, as you can see there, from that rather famous passage. One explanation for this kind of thing is that a scientist such as Hawking seems to take it that philosophers are attending to the same questions as scientists, but in trying to answer them, they are going about it the wrong way. What is not recognized is that philosophy is its own discipline with its own determinate content. And what is that determinate content? And where is it to be found? Psychology and physics seemingly have appropriated a good deal of the content of philosophy, and one way of reacquiring content, which was suggested by the logical positivists, would be for philosophy to be merely the handmaiden to science. Philosophy would thereby have access to determinate content, but the content would never be philosophy's own content. It would simply be the property of the sciences to be understood according to all of the conditions put in place by those sciences. The solution for Hegel is that philosophy is able to consolidate content through recollection, thereby allowing philosophy to avoid putting itself in a situation whereby it is either serving or having any authority over the natural sciences. Philosophy is thinking about thinking, and in recollection, the moment of action has passed, and whatever relations are discovered between contents appertain to the knowledge of knowledge, not to actionable aspects in the specific domains of the contents themselves. To put it another way, philosophy can gain a purchase upon the history of natural scientific thinking, along with all other kinds of thinking, to better account for the activity of thinking itself. And there you see that famous passage from Hegel. What we engender through studying this current stage of Geist or spirit is not a foundation or a single principle, but knowledge of knowing as presentation and recollection. This replaces our notion of knowledge as acquisition and explanation. Hegel indicates the character of philosophy with an image of memory. We are not able to think comprehensively about content that is ongoing, content that is still thriving and growing. The sign that a content is ready for philosophy is that it has grown old and we regard ourselves as beyond it. The owl of Minerva flies when the shades of night are gathering. Wisdom is only possible after the day is done, after events are settled, when the shape of life has grown old. Hegel's point here is that wisdom is not invention, wisdom is recollection. And what this means is that philosophy will have determinate content, but the content will be serving a different end than it did in the hands of the natural scientist. All the contents of philosophy, whether recollected from natural sciences, history, mathematics, religion, art, and so on, are relevant only insofar as they help us to know knowing. We do not recollect them in order to then take part in the particular disciplines from which they are borrowed. So this allows philosophy to have content and thus to pursue an investigation of thinking, not on abstract and vague terms, but in very concrete terms. Philosophy gathers up life for thinking in such a way that it is thinkable. Philosophy demonstrates the unity of being and thinking by thinking through what is, not what will be or could be or should be. Philosophy gathers, it does not produce. This means that philosophy will have a determinate content, but the content will be serving a different end than it did in the hands of the natural scientist. All the contents of philosophy, whether recollected from natural sciences, history, mathematics, religion, art, etc., are relevant only insofar as they help us to know knowing. We do not recollect them in order to then take part in the particular disciplines from which they are borrowed, so this allows philosophy to have content and thus to pursue an investigation of thinking, not on abstract and vague terms, but in very concrete terms. Philosophy gathers up life for thinking in such a way that it is thinkable. Philosophy demonstrates the unity of being and thinking by thinking through what is, not what will be or could be or should be. Philosophy gathers, it does not produce. It may not be overstating the case to say that all of Hegel's writing is mainly genealogical. All philosophers can do is recollect, and if all we can do is recollect, then everything that gets us there must be the path of how we got there in the first place. So everything in Hegel is genealogy. This is a key to understanding his philosophy, and needs to be borne in mind when reading other philosophers who are apparently anti-Hegelian, like Nietzsche, who said, "I mistrust all systematizers and avoid them. The will to system is a lack of integrity." He evidently has Hegel in his sights there, but Nietzsche wrote on the origin of our moral prejudices in his work which has the title On the Genealogy of Morality, and so, whether he realized it or not, he was being a good neo-Hegelian. You might have heard it said of Hegel that he declared the end of history, or the end of art, or the end of some other activity. Of course, he doesn't actually say it like that, but whatever issue we are considering, if whatever issue we are considering is not at an end in some way, then philosophy could not take it up as recollected content. Recollection as a contemplative or theoretical activity requires content that has matured, taken determinate shapes in succession, and revealed a developmental arc together with an underlying rhythm of activity. By knowing such activities that govern development, knowing comes closer to recognizing itself as a developmental activity, and philosophy is brought closer to the form of science so that it can set aside the name of love of knowing and be actual knowing. This follows naturally from grasping philosophy as rational recollection. What philosophy is about is something concrete and strictly present. We can only live and work and think in the actual present. Even the past must be brought into relation to the present. In thought, truth can only be seen from the standpoint of wholeness and completion, because all dependent things or parts point towards some whole, something absolute as their context. As a recollective system of science, it is a philosophy of philosophy. In the phenomenology of spirit, which presents the various shapes of spirits as stages on the way through which spirit becomes pure knowledge, there is the tension between the form of work, which is phenomenology, the philosophical study of objectivity and reality as subjectively lived and experienced, and its subject matter, Geist or spirit. For once a form of spirit is presented, it is undermined. The aim of the book is to reduce our attachment to thinking in images. The speculative thinking that we are trying to recollect through presentation is hostile to the effortlessness and solace of stable images. There is a conflict between the imagination and speculative thinking. Images presented in the phenomenology are undermined and negated, often not even fully formed, before they are already falling apart. Familiar representations are the anchor of our mental life in its individuated particular existence. Knowing and science, by contrast, require the negation of this familiarity and are undertaken not on behalf of the individual, but on behalf of the activity of the universal self and the interests of thinking. But not an accident as such, detached from what circumscribes it, what is bound and is actual only in its context with others, should attain an existence of its own and a separate freedom. This is the tremendous power of the negative. It is the energy of thought, of the pure I. The labour of the negative, as Hegel puts it. As we learned from Plato, the central contents of philosophy are ill-suited to direct definition. We cannot give a simple or clear answer to questions like what is thinking or what is philosophy. These are subjects that are dynamic and incorporate an abundance. So our job then is to inquire into them in such a way that this dynamism and this abundance is not prematurely closed off. Hegel proposes that articulation by means of determinate negations is the only possible approach. That exactly since it is slow and indirect. So it will not cut off the inquiry before it can gather into itself all the relevant considerations. But if we do not absorb ourselves in the images, we will miss the force of the negation of this familiarity undertaken not on behalf of the individual, but on behalf of the activity of the universal self and the interest of thinking. And the work of negativity will begin to appear like an imposed method rather than the inattention found in things themselves. And now we are at a stage where we have thousands of years of cultural achievement behind us. Ours is a stage of human cultural development that allows for universal education, forever banishing the esotericism that prepares one education for the vulgar and a separate education for the elite. Now all the once hidden ideas have been expressed, and they can be recalled for those that are patient enough. Patience. Patience replaces genius, since everyone can learn to be patient, while only some are gifted with genius, such patience-based recollection education is, in principle, if not necessarily in practice, open to everybody. Now patience, and remember patience is the great thing, and above all else, we must avoid anything like being or becoming out of patience. Master Kung, who is referenced there, that is Confucius, repeatedly inculcated the need of patience and thoroughness, as when he said in his Analects, and I quote, "Do not be desirous of having things done quickly. Do not look at small advantages. Desire to have things done quickly prevents their being done thoroughly. Looking at small advantages prevents great things being accomplished." End quote. And he also said, "The way of the superior man may be compared with what takes place in travelling. When to go to a distance, we must first traverse the space that is near, and when in ascending a height, we must first begin from the lower ground." Patience is the virtue of speculative philosophy, rather than analytical acumen, albeit you do need some of that as well. Knowing has to begin where it is. Knowing is a matter of looking around and taking stock, letting the current situation lead us back step by step to its sources, and when we try to speed this process along, we lose touch with truth entirely, since truth is not in any part by itself, but in the whole or in a great chain of recollection that reveals each seemingly independent element as a moment in a more comprehensive, ongoing activity. Momentums, to Master Kung's doctrine, you see there. Momentum, impetus, gained by movement, and also moments. Hegel often uses the word moment, moments of the whole, because of course the true is the whole. On motion, Hegel compared the German idealist epistemological controversy or debate about subjects and objects with the ancient ontological debate about the cause of motion, so that the issues concerning consciousness look rather dissimilar. The problem of consciousness and difference is now a special case of the problem of being and motion. As a consequence, the objective is no longer to discover a unified principle that grounds knowledge of subject and object, but to articulate how movement between moments of consciousness is possible, just as ancient philosophers wondered how motion in general was possible. Phew! What a warm time was in there. Phew. This is from chapter 1, when Humphrey Chimpton Eowicker emerges from the outdoor privy into fresh air. I mentioned how philosophy gathers up life. The gnarly bird serves as something of a warning here on how that is to be done. For philosophical purposes, that is. I cite this passage here because, on wondering what a very tableland of bleak barred fields meant, I looked through the secondary literature and found nothing. But I did come up with my own interpretation, which was triggered by my own reading. The things that I've read, I mean. The bard suggests Shakespeare, of course. The wind is blowing over the downs, a veritable table of green fields. This recollects the hostess's account of the death of Falstaff in Henry V. And I quote, "For after I saw him fumble with the sheets and play with flowers and smile upon his fingers' ends, I knew there was but one way, for his nose was as sharp as a pen, and babbled of green fields." End quote. This is a later emendation involving some guesswork, for the folio reads, "a table of green fields," which doesn't make much sense. Did Joyce have this original reading in mind while describing the veritable field of bleak bards, or blackbirds, if only from somewhere buried in the subconscious? The museum room, this is a museum, the outdoor privy serves as a museum in this particular passage. The music room episode, in the wake, provides a detailed description of miscellaneous objects conserved in the building, recounted by the keeper Kate, who is guide, collector and preserver of discarded objects. And Olivia Plurabelle, also the gnarly bird, because characters merge into one another, is a collector of the litter of the past, and there are two characters, Mutt and Jute, who are based on comic book characters Mutt and Jeff, who peer into a bin of hoarded objects in a fine old mess. Throughout the wake we come upon clusters of words having a common factor, be it the name of rivers, insects, of words in some particular language, or from a particular source, and where they appear they are always apposite. And the keeper Kate points out some miscellaneous souvenirs from the Battle of Waterloo, the supreme trophy, a hat, no less a hat than the triple-one hat of Napoleon, the very Napoleon hat itself. Napoleon is, of course, Napoleon. 3 soldiers crouched down in a ditch, the 3 Napoleon boyne crouching down in the living ditch. The museum, it now transpires, is a dung heap, foreshadowing the approaching attacks upon Humphrey Chimpton Earacher. Kate's museum is no more than a dung heap, odds and ends left behind after the war, but more significantly, Humphrey himself. The individuality of subjective spirit, however, is not to be understood in terms of such merely personal peculiarities or oddities that attach to one individual mind and not to another, for the structure of the mind is of interest insofar as it is universal in its character, what is essential and not what is accidental or contingent. Recollection is a universal character of mind, thereby in operation in every form of spirit. Empirical psychology, by contrast, is like the gnarly bird, simply picking up the facts as it finds them, taking them for granted, asking no questions, content to say that spirit has recollection, whereas philosophy demonstrates that recollection is an essential factor of spirit. The section ends with the tale of the Prank Queen. The tale of the Prank Queen was set long ago in an old, long-gone stone age of free love, when everybody lived a love with everybody else, and the tale apparently embodies in part a Victorian take on the evolution of language, from inarticulate grunts and whines of inexpressive giants, save when under the influence of great passion. Scheiße, shit, Scheiße, that's German. With the first words being loud and onomatopoeic utterances, the first language was a kind of poetic, creative singing. Jute had been instructed to stoop to the midden, and now the readers are urged to look at the book in their hands, their copy of the Wake, and observe how the movables are scrawling in motion, marching all of them ago in pit-pat and zing-zang, for every busy eerie wigs a bit of a Tory tale to tell. And yet, when it comes down to it, it is nothing but a simple tale of a man and his family. At its centre is as simple a tale as a paper can carry. It may well be simple, however, but it is the only one we have to tell, though we may tell it 1,000 times over. It never comes out the same twice, and they shall echo and re-echo for ever and ever. Well, to the Finnegans of anamnesis, with the whole bullish business. Anamnesis, Greek, calling to mind, reminiscence. In Plato's theory of epistemology, anamnesis, the recollection of innate knowledge acquired before birth, so learning involves the act of rediscovering knowledge from within oneself. Post-Enlightenment Europe, with its epistemological skepticism, treated philosophy as mere edifying talk about unknowable things. But now we have the ideal conditions for embracing philosophy as recollective contemplation for its own sake, by giving up our freedom to think whatever we want and submitting to the necessary movement of the content of thought, do we win the true freedom of thinking itself. By foregrounding determinate negation, thinking frees itself from fixity to become a pure activity of self-relation, and what we then present are not our desires for the forms of thought, but their own desires, drives, or nature. Let thinking flow, as a psychoanalyst lets see an analyze end. Freely associate. Hegel, like a psychoanalyst, believes there is an underlying logic to the flow of thinking that will only reveal itself to us with wide exploration and patient recollection. Plato's Socrates had noted that an argument, once it is written down, can neither defend itself nor come to its own aid. The finality of the page misrepresents the fluid, living, plastic, exploratory nature of thinking as genuine inquiry. Plato endeavoured to guard against such dogmatic finality through writing only in the dialogue form, and never speaking in his own voice, and yet he is mostly remembered as a dogmatist with a theory of forms, and many other set opinions. Philosophers are often remembered for momentary conclusions they reached, rather than the general spirit in which they worked. We come to philosophical discourses too invested in our own particular projects, and this gets in the way of our ability to take philosophical writings up in a disinterested, exploratory spirit. Hegel's work had been received as if it had been written non-dialectically, that is, as a series of fixed claims. The necessity of the movement of thinking was interpreted as the rigidity of a supposedly Hegelian Weltanschauung. But philosophy is not just composed out of points of view. What the reader may encounter as limitations, attributed to the totalizing Hegelian system, is not the fixity of the content, but the absence of personal license or subjective caprice. And when a writer gives us a determinate or fixed view, we can experience our own freedom in negating it. By compartmentalizing the author, we can liberate ourselves, but the freedom thereby gained is as abstract and empty as the rejection. To account for thinking as such, we need to discover ourselves within this description of thinking rather than against it, letting go of the capacity to fix the author's position and thereby lose our own freedom, our own feeling of freedom to reject it. We cannot accept or reject what we cannot situate, and we may experience this as being ensnared in Hegel's position, when in fact we are experiencing freedom from all fixed positions. And a deeper sense of freedom is discovered in sympathetic reading, not sympathy with an author as an individual, but sympathy with the content of thinking itself, losing ourselves in the real issue. Grasping the truth in negations is to grasp it indirectly. Negativity is foregrounded, hence words like Geist or Spirit are difficult to define, since words are employed in evolving ways as the negations accumulate. What we are given are not clear definitions and fixed categories. Rather, they endeavour to describe movements, dynamic happenings, by negating the fixed stopping points that are ordinarily employed as singular distinct units of meaning. This alters our sense of the pace of thinking, and rather than clear effective arguments, starting out from a few presuppositions, we are educated in the patience and hard work of the negative, and upon enough negations being garnered, we also discover that we cannot go back to the innocently simple views held prior to undertaking the slow work of negation, and the indication of success will be a new inability rather than a new power, namely the inability to hold reductive or simplistic views, since philosophy is not about holding and defending positions, but rather about the effort of thinking itself as it moves through positions. Learning to recognize meaning as a dynamic process through the indirect path of negation takes practice and patience. Abulia, a Greek word which you see there, whole abulish business. Abulia, ill-advisedness, thoughtlessness, irresolution. Abuelos also means, in Spanish, grandparents, although that's not really relevant here. Anyway, it is worth the effort because more direct approaches inevitably distort philosophy's rich content. At the same time, close attention to all the relevant unsatisfying views should disclose the pattern, rhythm, or grammar of thinking itself. The power that flows through all the views like a river flowing into the ocean, recirculating as rain on its headwaters, beside the rivering waters of, hither and thithering waters of. The system is not a grand construction of numerous interlocking views, but the study of the power that animates these views. In the wake, this is Anna Livia Pilobel. She is there to start, the river run. Guided by her rhythm, we work through not static outcomes, but originating acts of human thinking. Thinking is negative with regard to determinate entities, positive with regard to fluid activities. Negations always disclose something positive, never leaving us indifferent and unattached in the manner of skepticism, providing us with a flavour of the dynamic self-limiting process through which our limited and limiting views are formed and dissolved, finite content that is negated carefully and determinately, disclosing not a formless and bottomless pit, but a formative, determinative activity. The writings of both Hegel and Joyce sustain the bewilderment of thinking on the move, making it possible for us to experience the growing pains of a gradually deepening understanding. What we are dealing with are not grand dogmatic structures planned beforehand, but rather self-prolonging inquiries into how it is that the same fundamental activity expresses itself through a wide variety of forms. And since we have no direct access to the pure activity, we have to endure through its indifferent and unattached And since we have no direct access to the pure activity, we have to endure through its many forms in order to know it. Prose that appears contorted, vertiginous, and peculiar can aid in remembering the amount of prejudices lurking in more familiar modes of expression. Many of the methods associated with philosophy rush ahead and compartmentalize contents before their full range of movement has been expressed, while negativity delivers a slow and steady path that allows meaning to disclose itself. As readers, we have already learned how to take up thinking, where the only cue for sensation is a totally arbitrary and empty one, which is to say the word or the sign. Being literate, we are already speculative. Words are preserved negations of phenomenal appearances. Speculation lurks within us, prepared to be liberated upon our losing attachments to certain directional imagery, images that fix the otherwise dynamic activity of thinking into a fixed, unchangeable framework. The critic Jacques Aubert said of that first word there, riverrun, that it was unreadable. He spoke of such phenomena as, and I quote, the actualization of a noun as it emerges from an echo by means of the dismemberment and differential analysis of a set of adverbs and of a preposition, and this actualization coincides with another process, that of articulation, or the actualization of the article, in this case the indefinite article, end quote. But this is merely applying a structuralist reading to the wake. Adverbial dismemberment, absurd adjectival nominalization, terminal nounal echo, indeed. In the concluding, away, alone, alast, aloved, along the. The claim is made that what we are to witness to at the abrupt conclusion of Anna Livia's final monologue, flowing monologue, is a definite article calling attention to itself. The. And in the absence of a noun to mask the empty space to be signified that has been cleared by the article's powerful grammatical performative, the, like a finger pointing at nothing, comes to signify in and of itself signification, which is to say, by this analysis, which I'm not agreeing with, by the way, we are fooled by the fingers pointing at a void as our attention is misdirected away from the finger itself, and when faced with a semiotic situation with no apparent signified, the resulting anxiety that we experience may leave us scrambling for a referent. But what anxiety might that be? This takes Joyce to have mischievously provided us with a referent in the river run, with which the text opens, however many days, weeks, or months earlier we began our reading. But this is not how language works. Our experience of the world is not of a series of unconnected moments. The does not point to a void. Rather, recollection furnishes us with a temporarily extended present. The end. But that's a world of ways away. That's on page 28, as you see there. And there's still 40 pages to go of the wake. Not 40, 400. Anyway, thank you for listening.